Hi, everybody. It's Jim Ostrowski. I'm back with the Liberty Moving Podcast, episode 2. In the first episode, I kind of gave an introduction. It was a little low energy, but I had to give a lot of background as to what this is all about. So I thought in the second and third episodes, I'm going to redo a talk I gave last summer. I'm pretty much going to just sort of read it into the record the way it was, so there's going to be some obvious references that are different from today. I find, though, actually, some of the things I said about the left in the talk last August, I think will be a little prophetic, I hope, based on what's been happening now, which I did not know about. You judge theory by how well you predict things. I suppose that's one of the ways you judge theory. Not to get into the philosophy of science, but it's a long speech. It was about an hour, so I figure if I break it up into two parts, I'll make it into two podcasts. So it's kind of self-explanatory, but it was the 40th anniversary of my getting into the Liberty Movement, for good or for ill. Hasn't done my career that much good, but I think I'm on the right side of history and the right side of right and wrong. Also, 35 years as a lawyer, kind of celebrating that anniversary too. So I'm going to get right into it, and then after you hear part 1 and part 2 and the first three parts, you'll sort of know where I'm coming from, and everything else that I do in the show will make a lot of sense. And hopefully people, as the show goes on, people will go back and check out the first few episodes if they're wondering, well, who is this guy? I never heard of him. Hopefully he's interesting, but what's he all about? So this is kind of the origin story. So I'm just going to plunge into it. Thank you for coming to the celebration of the improbable success of the book that finally cracked the code of progressivism, the ideological mindset that has dominated our politics for 100 years. Which has a firm lock on the idea-disseminating organs of society, that launched a counter-revolution against liberty in a country founded on liberty, after mankind suffered and struggled through thousands of years of dark and dreary slavery, exploitation, mindless violence, and official tyranny. And finally, which is causing the very first period of palpable decline in America. I think that's prophetic. Since we first got off the boat in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia. With little marketing, no book tour, and while being completely ignored by the mainstream media, Progressivism, a primer on the idea destroying America, has sold over 10,000 copies. But that is just a drop in the bucket of what we can accomplish with your help. Just in the past few hours, our book bomb has managed to sell many additional copies. With your help in the coming months, we will saturate the country with copies and begin to turn the tide against the destructive idea of progressivism. I want to thank some of the great people in the movement who helped promote the book and have otherwise done tremendous work on behalf of liberty for many, many years. Ron Paul, Lou Rockwell, Alana Mercer, Tom Woods, and Robert Wenzel. We need to get the primer into every high school, college, bar, barbershop, coffee shop, and library in the country. The progressives and leftists dominate the schools, the media, Hollywood, and almost every other idea disseminating institution in society except talk radio, podcasts, and the school of hard knocks. There are tens of millions of copies of progressive books out there. Is it too much to ask that, in opposition to the avalanche of books glorifying the almighty state, there be floating around a country of 330 million people, a mere 1 million copies of the book that exposed the greatest scam in American history, progressivism? Today we celebrate reaching 1% of that goal. Excelsior, onward and upward. I've always been a numbers guy, so along with 10,000 sold, there are some more nice round numbers at play this evening. This is the 35th year I've been practicing law, and this is the 40th year in the libertarian movement, or as I prefer to call it, the liberty movement. It is one of those classic left-wing lies that libertarianism is some sort of new modern cult that originated with Ayn Rand. In truth, the first organized and self-conscious liberty movement dates back to circa 1650 in England. Not immediately, but eventually this movement changed the world and basically created the modern world, at least most of what is good about the modern world. Liberty was the greatest political idea humanity ever had and led to a long list of amazing accomplishments, none of which is widely credited to libertarianism or liberalism as it was known in those days. These include the right to self-ownership, the right to private property, the definition of liberty itself, which I like to sum up as the right to do what you wish with what you own, the right of revolution, natural rights not created, defined, or dependent on the state, freedom of religion, the Industrial Revolution, the greatest improvement in the human condition in 50,000 years, radical opposition to war and the advocacy of peace. Liberty equals peace. Liberty equals peace. The abolition of slavery, free trade, free speech and habeas corpus, equal natural rights for women, opposition to conscription, the right to bear arms, the right of gays to be left alone by the state, the Bill of Rights, freedom of travel and movement around the planet. The progressives gave us passports, by the way. And finally, multicultural tolerance and peace. Let me quote from the book, which is the reason why we are here tonight. This brief survey of the magnificent accomplishments of liberalism illustrates the huge gulf between the achievements of the historical liberty movement and the extremely poor image the public has of the contemporary liberty movement. If the movement had hired a public relations firm to poison the public mind about us, the results would be similar. We are a bunch of kooks, a bunch of Don Quixotes whose ideas have had no impact on the world. We all live in mom's basement. We are Ayn Rand cultists. We are racist, anti-Semites, and gay bashers. We are the champions of the interest of billionaires and plutocrats and large multinational corporations. A pack of lies. In fact, our ideological ancestors were champions of the poor, the powerless, and the weak. They were champions of persecuted racial, ethnic, cultural, and religious minorities, as well as the foremost advocates for the rights of the accused and prisoners. The liberty movement has much work to do to repair its false image. In summary, liberalism was a beautiful set of interlocking ideas that helped liberate humanity from age-old poverty, oppression, and despair from 1650 through 1900. Though the liberal era ended, many of its ideas and accomplishments continue and are responsible for most of what is good about the modern world. As I explained in the book, after these great successes, liberty was displaced by an irrational and reactionary movement we know as progressivism. Probably the worst political idea of modern times, progressivism, nevertheless, has had great public relations. Progressivism has been the dominant political idea in America for the last 100 years, and as I explain in great detail in the book, is responsible for the counter-revolution of the massive and constant growth of the state that the liberty movement thought it had defeated in 1776. As a result, America, since around 2001, is in its first ever state of actual decline, not stagnation, decline. The evidence is all around us to see for those not blinded by ideology. As Jesus said, "You have eyes, can't you see?" Another unfortunate casualty of progressivism, in addition to our liberty, was the theft of our beautiful word liberal, which the progressives stole from us, forcing us to use the ungainly term libertarian. I favor stealing it back. After progressives seized power around 1915, the classical liberals died off and the movement almost went extinct, kept alive by just a motley crew of a few dozen brilliant libertarians such as Albert J. Nock and H.L. Mencken. The flame was later kept alive in the lean years by the three women, Ayn Rand, Isabel Patterson, and Rose Wilder Lane. Ludwig von Mises was chased out of Europe by the Nazis and landed at NYU, where he schooled Rothbard and the rest of the Circle Bastiat, which included my friend Ralph Raico. Throughout the 60s, this small cadre plotted to create a mass movement, and the time to act came in 1969 when libertarians split from conservatives over their age-old opposition to war and conscription, in this case, the Vietnam War. Out of this crucible, the modern liberty movement was born. For the next 50 years, the libertarian movement tried to use rational argument to advance liberty. The result, however, was bigger government and less liberty with each passing year. The fatal flaw in this approach was the failure to realize that we're all talking to a wall, that progressivism had constructed a mental force field around the minds of 90% of Americans who refused to hear a single word we said. Progressivism is a self-imposed mental disability that robotically prevents the progressives from noticing certain facts and impels the progressive to exaggerate the importance of other facts. Because the progressive is, in effect, trapped in his own mindset, it is not surprising that he fails to perceive his own trap, his own bias. Specifically, since the progressive believes that some government program or another is the solution to all human problems, the progressive can never bring himself to accept that his favorite government programs have failed miserably. We're seeing this now, of course, in the streets. Rather, they end up in an endless search for non-governmental scapegoats. Sound familiar? Last night's news? To blame for their policy failures. For the first time, the primer explained the mindset of progressives and why the typical rationalist libertarian approach of persuasion had failed. In the near future, I will publish books dissecting the other two predominant irrational mindsets that allow government to grow and liberty to shrink continually, leftism and archism. I will do to leftism what I did to progressivism. I'm outside, so there's a few bugs. What I did to progressivism, logically dissect and destroy it. As for archism, for the first time, I think, since I basically coined the term, I will explain to the archists of the world what they believe, because I don't think they know what they believe. Nobody ever explained it to them, and they never figured it out on their own. It's my job. There are thus three interconnected mindsets that underlie the cargo cult of the state: progressivism, leftism, and archism. Let's take the last one first, as it's a term that you may not have seen before. I will explain the term more fully in a forthcoming book, but archism simply means all the implied beliefs, rarely stated out loud, involved in the seemingly benign and almost universal belief that we need one or more states in this world. My point is, just because we have states does not mean the implications of that fact are not exceedingly important for understanding what is happening on a daily basis. The great irony is that we think we understand the opposite of archism, anarchism, very well, even though it does not exist, while we barely understand archism, even though the state exists everywhere. Long story short, the state, by its very nature, continually generates low-grade, medium-grade, and high-octane conflict in society. You're seeing it every day. The state generates conflict. The state generates conflict. Probably 99% of Americans are archists. Don't expect them to easily see the problem. That's why I'm writing a primer about it. But the Roman poet Juvenal saw the problem clearly 1900 years ago in terms directly relevant to the current controversy over police shootings. Who will guard the guardians themselves? I would say about 90% of Americans are progressives. Yes, even many conservative Republicans. They are a huge part of the problem. Obviously, every progressive is also anarchist. In the great historical conflict that Rothbard has described as the endless war between society and the state, the progressive believes that for any problems that emerge, the almighty state can usually solve the problem better than society can. As I explain in detail in Progressivism, a Primer, progressivism is not a rational system of thought. Progressivism is not an argument. It's a form of therapy that uses the state to reduce existential angst. That's why it's so hard to eradicate. Just like booze, it works temporarily. The progressive is a stateaholic, but the rest of us get the progressive hangover too. Lastly, we come to the most dastardly of the three cargo cult mindsets, leftism. This is all provisional, as I haven't decided whether leftism consists of one big bad idea or a set of bad ideas, and if the latter, how the bad ideas fit together to form a coherent ideology. Obviously, leftism involves a maniacal desire for the state to make everyone equal in the sense of material condition or result. But I suspect the roots of leftism are far more insidious than even that totalitarian nightmare. My working hypothesis is that at the core of leftism is a subliminal desire by unhappy people to use the state to mitigate their unhappiness by making lots of other people miserable as well, and by exercising power over them, the ultimate revenge of the miserable. I think that theory is being worked out right before your eyes every day. What percentage of the population is leftist in the above sense? Hard to say, but I think 15% is about right. Keep in mind that the root of leftism is personal unhappiness, which means as America declines into progressive big government, the resulting increase in unhappiness produces more leftists. So progressivism grows the state increases unhappiness increases the numbers of leftists, and finally, ironically, since the right is a reaction to the left, the number of leftists increases the number of alt-rightists. That explains the current circus of American politics. It goes without saying that every leftist is a progressive, but not every progressive is a leftist. Leftists, however, exercise an undue influence out of proportion to their numbers due to virulent fanaticism fueled by rage. Again, I said this 11 months ago. What the three mindsets share is support for state power per se and increasing state power robotically in response to the crisis du jour. The problem is that this does not solve problems, but merely creates new and bigger ones. Yet, since these mindsets are not rational or based on evidence, the same mistakes are made over and over again without compunction or recognition of error. This is the conundrum in which America finds itself in August of 2019. For this, you can thank the cargo cultists of the state, the purveyors of caveman politics, the politics of the gleeful use of political violence without conscience, and some, the politics of the sociopath. So let's talk about why the modern resurgence of the liberty movement, which reached its high water mark in the Ron Paul campaigns, failed. First, because it failed to realize that its opponents were fueled by these three interlocking political mindsets: progressivism, leftism, anarchism. Mindsets the liberty movement had failed to identify, grasp, elucidate, and strategize to defeat. Second, and equally important, we have neglected the science of strategy and tactics and have chosen to fight the state on its strongest ground, politics, meaning elections, lobbying, and courts. To quote Sun Tzu, "So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak." As I wrote in Direct Citizen Action, if there is a single political strategist working full-time in the liberty movement, it is the best-kept secret of all time. The liberty movement lacks what every high school football team has every Saturday afternoon in the fall: a strategy, a plan for victory. Third, we have poorly marketed our product and have allowed our opponents to win the battle of the dictionary. They get to define the basic terms used in political debates, words that are deceptively defined, to rig the debate in advance. For example, regulation is a word that most people associate with government protecting them from bad stuff. How could libertarians be against that? What is the matter with us? What if we define regulation as when the government uses violence against peaceful people, harming no one? Essentially, when the government mugs you, they call it regulation, and that's how they get away with it. We need to win the battle of the dictionary instead of being blissfully unaware that there is such a battlefield. As the second Ron Paul campaign was winding down, I realized that steps needed to be taken to keep the movement going and growing, and I sat down on April 15th, 2012, and conceived a three-part plan which included Progressivism, a primer, a website to carry out its ideas, libertymovement.org, and a multimedia project to explain the liberty movement to the world in an innovative way. That was in 2012. However, due to the demands of law practice, I was not able to get the book out until 2014 and was not able to create a fully functioning website. The media project was to be funded by book sales, so that had to wait until later. Since I wasn't able to get my projects off the ground and apparently no one else in the movement stepped forward to provide similar leadership, the movement faltered, and into the leadership vacuum, movements hostile to liberty stepped in to fill the gap. These included the far left, the alt-right, and finally Trumpism. These movements thrive to one degree or another because the liberty movement failed to present to the masses concrete solutions to the numerous problems caused by big government that plague their daily lives. After Ron Paul's campaigns, we simply left the political battlefield, and these competing groups seized the day, and we became irrelevant. Nature abhors a vacuum, and they filled it. The failure is not in the stars, but in ourselves. The liberty movement does have solutions to the underlying problems of real people that lead them to be seduced by all three movements, and in fact, we are the only ones who have these solutions. However, the masses don't even know who we are or what our solutions are. If they know us at all, it's because they may have been attacked by left libertarians who live in gated communities for being racists, for not wanting 1 million illegal aliens to move in their neighborhoods. So naturally, they fall prey to various hucksters and con artists who oppose liberty. The far left exploits the poverty caused by progressive big government and the fear of the police, whose interactions with minorities all too often stem from the progressives' war on drugs and from revenue-raising traffic stops. We have answers to these problems, but never made them known. We absented ourselves from the political battlefield. The alt-right and Trumpism exploited the economic stagnation of the working class caused by progressive big government. Again, only the liberty movement has viable solutions to the other problems that concern their constituencies, but we were AWOL after Ron Paul's great campaigns. If the masses were paying any attention to libertarians in those days, all they would have heard is calls for more globalism and less local control. How did libertarians get mixed up with advocates of globalism, which most working class people believe is hostile to their interests? I don't necessarily have an easy answer to these questions right now, but they need to be addressed, and I will try to address them. I don't have all the answers, but as a pretty decent lawyer, I think I do have most of the important questions. So let's talk about immigration and nationalism. And I may have just committed career suicide. The left's position appears to be open borders at the moment, but that term is never defined, and their position appears to be merely a strategy to turn the country to the left by importing people likely to vote Democratic. The left has no real taste for individual freedom, so we can expect their open borders position to be conveniently terminated after they have turned America into a one-party state. Thereafter, they will likely abandon the policy for various obvious reasons arising out of left-wing ideology. The hostility of many immigrants to women's and gay rights, overpopulation, the environment, congestion, and urban sprawl. Obviously, the left would also oppose open borders for any groups unlikely to vote Democratic. So the left's support for open borders is cynical, strategic, and temporary. Many libertarians also describe themselves as open borders proponents, but rarely define what that means. Open borders or closed borders? I don't think either side has even defined what those terms mean. So I know there are strong feelings on both sides, but don't chastise somebody for not agreeing with you when you haven't even defined what you mean. I don't know what open borders means. I've never seen a definition of it. If 1 million Chinese troops land in Virginia, we should just let them into the country? Maybe we should register them to vote and give them welfare and pistol permits. And what about the so-called closed borders people? I'm not sure what their position is either. So the point is, immigration is a big debate. It drove the last presidential election and apparently drives a lot of people. I know why the left and the globalists want open borders. It's obvious that the left wants open borders because they want to shift the country to the left by rigging democracy to elect a new electorate. I think that's just blatantly obvious. You have to understand why they're doing it. It is obvious that they're not doing it out of love for humanity. They're doing it to get raw political power. Does the liberty movement really want to get behind a movement that's designed to give the left absolute political power in America? Why do the globalists favor open borders? There is this whole debate between, nationalism and globalism. We've really yet to address this in the movement. But if you're against nationalism, doesn't that mean you're for globalism? Because they seem to be opposites. Why are the globalists against nationalism? because the globalists don't like nations. Why? Because nations are hard to control. Look at the Poles. They're hard to control, and thank God. They helped bring down the evil empire of communism, the stubborn, small little nation that Hitler and Stalin combined failed to destroy. What does nation mean? Many people don't know what nation means. I'm against nationalism. Oh, so you're against nations. Well, I don't know. So you don't even know what a nation is, and you're against nationalism, a word that can mean different things. This is part of the huge problem here. But one possible definition of nationalism is the belief that there should be nations. How in the world does a movement that favors the ability of the individual to control his own fate somehow get aligned on the issue of immigration with globalists who want to destroy all local control and want to run everything from Brussels or God knows where? And how do we line up on this issue with leftism, which is probably the most destructive political idea of modern times? The masses would rightly think that libertarians on immigration-related issues are aligned with the globalists and the leftists. No thanks. No wonder that so many people have rushed off and fled from libertarianism to go elsewhere. I don't think it's any wonder at all. I think it's perfectly bloody obvious. So we have to rethink nationalism. Yeah, you can just hear them now. You don't understand libertarianism. Libertarianism is a form of individualism. Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. Libertarianism favors the liberty of the individual. What if individuals, when they're perfectly free to do what the hell they want with their property and lives, decide to form groups? Because if you look at what people have done throughout history when there isn't a government gun pointed at their head, what do they do? What do these free individuals do with their individualistic liberty? Most of them get together in groups. Most of them get together in groups of people who are fairly similar to themselves in certain characteristics because they think that enhances their individualistic self-interest. And some of these groups could be fairly called nations because a nation is simply a group of people who self-consciously identify with each other based on certain characteristics they share in common and they feel are important somehow. So who are we to object if we support their right to do what they please with what they own? So I think I've established that libertarians are not necessarily hostile to nations properly understood. Now, the word nationalism can mean different things and things that libertarians do not support, so we have to be careful about that. How about playing word games? I think it's essential in any form of communication with other human beings that we try to understand what they're saying instead of just setting up straw man arguments we knock down so we can feel superior. So let's understand what people are talking about and not play word games. Because there's no God of the dictionary, and thank God the government doesn't control the dictionary yet. Not every definition of nation is a bad thing from a libertarian point of view. If you're a libertarian, you have to support the right of people to do peaceful things, including forming groups that could be considered to be nations. I was always taught that libertarianism was anti-statist because of all the evil deeds the state had done throughout history. I could construct a pretty good theory of world history as follows. People, when free to do so, get together and form groups of like-minded people, nations. Then the state comes along and beats the hell out of them. For example, many of the civil wars in history involve a conflict between states and politically weak nations within their borders. So libertarians can't have it both ways. You can't claim to be anti-statist and anti-war, and at the same time fail to defend voluntarily formed nations or similar groups when the state does to them what it has been doing throughout recorded history. Invade them, murder them, steal their land, dominate them, rape them, or ultimately wipe them out entirely. That's my opinion anyway. So on immigration, what's the libertarian position? I call my proposal the International Easy Pass. This is my opinion right now until somebody smarter than me comes up with a better idea. First, you have to distinguish between natural rights and legal rights. There is a natural right for individuals to move around the earth unless they are violating somebody else's self-ownership or ownership of justly acquired property. Now, we all have this public property, and that's the real problem, I guess. And I guarantee my solution will trigger the extreme left and the extreme right, and I think that's virtual proof of its validity. So, you do have a right to freely move around the earth unless you're violating someone else's individual liberty or private property. However, you do not have a right to invade a country. You don't have a right to land 1 million Chinese troops or Russian troops on the beach in Virginia. I think that's preposterous. I think I might as well just go out of business, and then I'll just do something else for the rest of my life because I'm out. I don't want to be associated with that position. I don't think you have the right to move around the earth to be a terrorist. So if I'm going to Zurich to blow up the city hall, no, I don't have the right to do that. Now, how do you define all that procedurally? I don't know. I can't solve all the problems of the earth in one freaking speech. So what else? Do you have a right to move to a country and become a citizen of that country? Well, that's not a natural right. I personally would love to be able to go to Poland or Ireland or any number of countries, live there for a while, do some work, and sell a few books without becoming a citizen. It's in my self-interest that I do not become a citizen, because if I become a citizen just by living there for 2 weeks, they might not let me in the first place. So if you're really for the free movement of people, you will not have any problem with that proviso that just by going someplace, you don't become a citizen. And by the same logic, if your family travels and they have a child when you're in Zurich, that child does not become a citizen. Also, if I travel to Zurich and get sick, they don't have to pay my medical bills, and there is no right to welfare. Now, I think you should be able to work or start a business. I know some countries will oppose that, but I think that is a fair statement of the libertarian principle. I think you do have a natural right to produce wealth and trade, and frankly, I don't see any real reason why the host country would want to stop you from doing so. I don't care if some person who is not a citizen comes into my area to do agricultural work or any other kind of work. It's not hurting me. It's helping me, but there's a debate where the Trumpists obviously disagree. They have a whole different view of economics than we do, and we're right and they're wrong. So International Easy Pass is, I think, a plausible libertarian view of immigration. In this system, all those who now claim they care about the welfare of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, without paying any price for that claim, could prove how virtuous they are by paying for their food, their clothing, and their shelter when they come here.